Hello and welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely, and I just want to record a short podcast on the recent attack by Ukraine on Russia's airfields, in particular, the attack on Russia's strategic bombers, and in particular, on the question of why there has been so little response from President Trump. And as we've discussed in a number of podcasts and live streams, President Trump, who is not shy about speaking out on all manner of things, and in particular on all manner of issues relating to the war in Ukraine, President Trump took it upon himself last week to issue a number of very strong, very vehement condemnations of Russia in general and President Putin in particular, and in particular on the question of the bombing of Kiev. And so President Trump spoke out at news conferences, and he sent out a number of truths denouncing President Putin, essentially declaring that he has gone off his head for launching attacks on Kiev. And because somehow there was supposed to be a peace process in place, Trump suggested, then these attacks from Russia and Ukraine were outrageous. And then now, as of Sunday, there had been this attack by Ukraine on Russian strategic bombers, a part of the Russian nuclear triad. And this elicited no comment from President Trump, and particularly as this attack on Sunday came a few hours before the meeting scheduled for Istanbul. So it seemed very strange if Trump was last week was so exercised over Russian attacks on Ukraine taking place while there was a peace process taking place. Now he seemed to have nothing very much to say, particularly given that the attacks on the strategic bombers could not have taken place without information from the United States as to where was their location, and probably even some issue on the trajectory and flight paths of any drones that were to hit them. So that clearly this would definitely implicate the United States, and yet Trump said nothing. Now, finally, today, Trump did respond, and in a quite interesting way. It was because that a phone call had taken place between Trump and Putin, and the phone call had indeed dealt with the issue of this attack on the Russian strategic bombers. Now, before we get to that, one thing that also has to be kept in mind, that over the weekend, there were also some attacks by Ukraine on Russian railway bridges, And that led to the collapse of a bridge on top of a passenger train, and that culminated in the death of 7 passengers. Um, so today, President Putin held a meeting with his government that dealt at some length with this attack on the Russian railway bridges, as well as what progress, if any, had taken place during the negotiations in Istanbul. Interestingly, the one thing that this Russian governmental meeting did not address was the attack on a Russian strategic bomber. So this took place earlier in the day before the telephone conversation between Trump and Putin. So let's just take a look at the transcript of this meeting, and here we have this is from the Kremlin site. It says the head of state held a meeting with members of the government via video conference. And it says the recent blowing up of railway tracks in the Bryansk and Kursk regions is, of course, a terrorist act. And decisions to commit such crimes were, of course, made in Ukraine at the political level. What would I like to note in this regard? This is Putin speaking. Of course, everywhere and always during armed conflicts, to our great regret, civilians suffered. But what happened in Bryansk, that Bryansk was where the railway bridge collapsed on top of the passenger train, and where the 7 passengers were killed. So what happened in Bryansk is a targeted attack on civilians, and according to all international norms, such actions are called terrorism. All the crimes that were committed against civilians, including women and children, on the eve of the next round of peace talks we proposed in Istanbul were certainly aimed at disrupting the negotiation process. The civilian population was deliberately targeted. This only confirms our fears that the already illegitimate regime in Kiev, which once seized power, is gradually degenerating into a terrorist organization, and its sponsors are becoming accomplices of terrorists. So as he goes on, you can see that he's pretty much dismissing any real prospects of a negotiated agreement with people that he deems to be terrorists. And here we go. Let us recall, just recently, the Ukrainian authorities and their allies dreamed of a strategic defeat of Russia on the battlefield. Today, against the backdrop of huge losses, retreating along the entire line of combat contact, trying to intimidate Russia, the Kiev leadership has moved on to organizing terrorist acts. And at the same time, they are asking us to suspend military actions for 30 or even 60 days, asking for a meeting at the highest level. But how can such meetings be held in these conditions? What should they talk about? Who negotiates with those who rely on terror with terrorists? See, he's now suggesting really there's no point in continuing with these negotiations. And why should they be encouraged by providing a respite in military operations that will be used to pump the regime with Western weapons to continue the forced mobilization and preparation of other terrorist acts similar to those that were carried out in the Bryansk and Kursk regions? And then, what kind of authority can the leaders of a thoroughly rotten and completely corrupt regime have? The whole world is talking about this. What kind of competence can those be proud of? By whose will the Ukrainian armed forces, for example, in the Kursk region, suffered absolutely senseless, huge losses, and today suffer one defeat after another on the battlefield. Apparently, we are dealing with people who not only do not possess any significant competence in anything, but also elementary political culture, if they allow themselves to make certain statements and even direct insults to those with whom they are trying to negotiate about something. As for the latest refusal to agree to a ceasefire for 2 or 3 days, so this is what he's talking about here, is a proposal that was put forward in Istanbul to allow both sides to collect dead bodies and with a view to exchanging the dead bodies of one another's soldiers. So Russia has already proposed handing over to Ukraine 6,000 dead bodies. Ukraine hasn't proposed doing anything similar, but here the Russians are saying, but we'll hold a ceasefire for 2 or 3 days to allow the two sides to collect dead bodies, and then we can make the exchange. And so that's what he says here. As for the latest refusal, so Ukraine has said no to this proposal. They would say, no, we want this 30-day unconditional ceasefire. But here the Russians are, well, we'll have this 2 or 3 day ceasefire. Ukraine says no. So he says, as for the latest refusal to agree to a ceasefire for 2 or 3 days for humanitarian reasons, this is not the first time. It does not surprise us, but only convinces us that today's Kiev regime does not need peace at all. Peace for it most likely means the loss of power. And power for this regime apparently is more important than peace and the lives of people whom they apparently do not consider their own. So here, is, as I said, really suggesting that there's no point in talking to these people. They're terrorists, they're gangsters. They're only proposing ceasefires in order to get as much Western weaponry into Ukraine, and essentially they've no interest at all in any kind of a peaceful settlement. Now, as I say, during this meeting with members of his government, Putin made no mention of the attack on the strategic bombers. He talked at great length about the attacks in Bryansk and Kursk, and there was also a lengthy discussion about what happened in Istanbul on Monday, but nothing at all about the attack on the strategic bombers. So today, later on, after this meeting, Putin and Trump held a telephone conversation. It's not clear either from Trump's statement or the readout from the Kremlin at whose initiative this conversation took place, because this will be the fourth conversation between Trump and Putin, but each of the previous conversation um, had been scheduled well in advance. So we knew that they were coming. There was a lot of expectation of what would transpire. But in this case, no one had any idea that there was going to be this telephone conversation. So it really, is quite interesting to know which side initiated this telephone call. So there was, first of all, the truth that was sent out by Trump. This came before the Kremlin readout. And so here's what Trump says. I just finished speaking by telephone with President Vladimir Putin of Russia. The call lasted approximately 1 hour and 15 minutes. We discussed the attack on Russia's docked airplanes. So as I say, there was no discussion about the attack on the planes in during the meeting with the members of the government. But here, this is the first thing they talked about, and obviously, it's of some concern, and that's why it's very important to know who initiated this phone call. Was it the Americans who wanted to reassure the Russians that they had nothing to do with this attack on its strategic aircraft? Or was it the Russians who wanted to elicit from the Americans what their view was, what was their position on the on this attack? Were they involved in the attack? Did they approve of it? Do they approve of it now? So it's interesting to know who wanted this conversation to take place. So it says, we discussed the attack on Russia's docked airplanes by Ukraine and also various other attacks that have been taking place by both sides. Then Trump goes on, it was a good conversation, but not a conversation that will lead to immediate peace. Now, this is very interesting because as far as I can tell, this is pretty much the first time Trump is admitting that there's little likelihood of peace anytime in the near future. Up until now, leave aside the bravado during the campaign, how he's going to sort it out in 24 hours. But up until now, he had been quite optimistic about resolving this war. There's always talk, well, the negotiations are going well, we're making progress, we're close to an agreement. He's been saying this, even though the evidence was really to the contrary. It didn't look like there was really much progress being made towards the resolution. But now this is really the first time he says, not a conversation that will lead to immediate peace. And then he goes on, President Putin did say, and very strongly, that he will have to respond to the recent attack on the airfields. So in other words, Putin, according to Trump, had made clear that he will respond to the attack on the airfields, and that he, Trump, will just have to suck it up. He's just going to have to accept it. So President Putin did say, and very strongly, that he will have to respond to the recent attack on the airfields. And Trump is really more or less saying, yeah, it's going to happen, and we're just going to have to accept this. And then you'll go, Trump segues into discussing Iran. And he said, we also discussed Iran and the fact that time is running out on Iran's decision pertaining to nuclear weapons, which must be made quickly. So once again, Trump is back on the artificial deadlines as to why must this decision be made quickly. Again, these are complicated negotiations. What's this arbitrary clock that's running? Unless it's the idea that, well, Bibi Netanyahu is not going to wait and he's ready to start bombing Iran. But of course, that's a totally fraudulent deadline, because the United States is in a position to bring Netanyahu to heel. He has all the means at his disposal to make sure that Israel gets with the program and doesn't just do anything unilaterally. And Trump has indeed said that he's not going to accept any unilateral actions on the part of Israel while negotiations with Iran are taking place. So here he's suddenly saying, well, time is running out. Why? What basis? Other than he's suggesting that Israel, he can no longer restrain Israel. So that's of course is fraudulent. And then he said, I stated to President Putin that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. And on this, I believe that we were in agreement. Well, that's, I think, without question, true. That is Russia's official position, that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. Russia, however, does not accept the use of force against Iran. So that, you can say, yeah, Russia's on board that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon, but it doesn't approve of your policy of threatening to bomb Iran. And on this, I believe that we were in agreement. President Putin suggested that he will participate in the discussions with Iran and that he could perhaps be helpful in getting this brought to a rapid conclusion. So he's basically, as Trump describes it, and that's totally plausible, that Russia is ready to facilitate negotiations. So he says, but to a rapid conclusion. Again, this artificial deadline. It is my opinion that Iran has been slow walking their decision on this very important matter, and we will need a definite answer in a very short period of time. So this Iran is slow walking. Iran isn't, of course, slow walking. The bone of contention has been from the beginning that Iran insists on its right to enrich uranium for purposes of its civilian nuclear program, as it is entitled to do under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. At various times during these negotiations, the United States seemed to accept that Iran could enrich uranium to obviously a very low level, far from the level necessary to build an atom bomb, and that something could be worked out with Iran, whereby it will enrich uranium to this very low level under the auspices of international inspectors, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and even U.S. inspectors. There's been talk of Iran accepting U.S. inspectors overseeing uranium enrichment. So that at various times it looked as if the Americans were willing to accept this, but now in recent days, Trump and Rubio and Witkoff have changed their tune and have said that they will not accept any enrichment of uranium inside Iran. That, of course, is a non-starter with Iran. I mean, that's Iran has made that clear that that's an absolute unconditional demand. And so for Trump to say, "Oh, they're slow walking," they're not slow walking anything. They made clear what their position is. Their position hasn't changed. They have no intention of building nuclear weapons, but they do insist that Iran be allowed to enrich uranium inside Iran. That Iran isn't going to accept that it can purchase enriched uranium from other countries. That's just simply not on for Iran, for the obvious reason that if it doesn't have enriched uranium on its territory and it needs to purchase it from elsewhere, then within the days of signing that agreement, the United States will, of course, prevent Iran from purchasing enriched uranium. I mean, it's obvious that that's going to happen. And within days, maybe even within hours of Iran signing an agreement. So obviously, Iran's not going to accept um, purchasing enriched uranium from other countries. Um, anyway, so that was the truth that Trump sent out, and then in a little while later, the Kremlin posted a readout. It was a little bit unusual as a readout because it was actually a statement by a Kremlin aide, Yuri Ushakov, who has been taking part in the negotiations. He met um, Marco Rubio in Saudi Arabia. So he's been involved in these high level negotiations. So here he provides this commentary on the phone call. And so Ushakov says, "Good evening, colleagues. About an hour ago, the fourth telephone conversation between our president and US President Donald Trump ended. If you are interested, this conversation lasted about an hour and 10 minutes. How did the conversation begin? Naturally, with a discussion of the situation around Ukraine. Putin spoke in detail about the result of the second round of direct Russian-Ukrainian negotiations in Istanbul." So that the issue of the Istanbul talks didn't come up in Trump's truth. In fact, most of Trump's truth pertained to Iran. And then these negotiations, as was emphasized, Ukraine tried to disrupt by carrying out, on direct orders from the Kiev regime, targeted attacks on purely civilian targets on the peaceful population. This is clearly qualified as terrorism by international law, and in our opinion, the Kiev regime has essentially degenerated into a terrorist organization. The Russian side did not succumb to provocations, and the second round, as is known, took place in Istanbul. So it's again very interesting that Ushakov starts off with the discussion about the attacks on the two railway bridges in Bryansk and Kursk, and the death of civilians, but not about the subject that the people are much more concerned about, which is the attack on the strategic aircraft, which, and I say, repeat, Putin did not touch upon it during his discussion with the government. I would like to emphasize once again that our president spoke in detail about the content of the negotiations, their results, and emphasized that overall these negotiations were useful. The corresponding memoranda exchanged will be analyzed in the capitals, in Moscow and Kiev, and then, as we hope, the parties can continue the negotiations. So this sounds much more positive about the continuation of the negotiations than Putin's lengthy characterizations of the terrorist regime in Kiev would lead you to believe, because it seemed there, and in fact, Putin said it several times, what's the point of talking to these people? They are just a bunch of terrorists. They have no interest in peace. They're just using these negotiations in order to continue perpetrating their terrorist acts. So now here he's saying, very, very positive. Yeah, well, it was useful meeting in Istanbul, and both sides are studying one another's memoranda, and it is to be hoped that there will be another round of negotiations. And then he says, as for the strikes on military airfields, so finally we get to the topic at hand, which is what Trump led with. As for the strikes on military airfields, this topic was also touched upon. Moreover, Donald Trump reaffirmed that the Americans were not informed about this in advance. This has been the position of the United States, and was repeated by Caroline Leavitt a couple of days ago, that the administration had not been told in advance of this attack on the airfields. So moreover, Donald Trump reaffirmed that the Americans were not informed about this in advance. Naturally, the leaders agreed to continue contacts on the Ukrainian issue, including at the highest level, as well as other levels and through other channels. But besides this, besides Ukraine, a whole range of international issues were discussed, I would say with an emphasis on the somewhat stalled situation in the negotiations between the US and Iran on the Iranian nuclear program. Donald Trump believes that Russia's assistance may be needed here, and he would be grateful if Russia could work with the Iranian side accordingly. So that pretty much confirms what Trump had said in his truth. In addition, the Middle East was also touched upon, as well as the armed conflict between India and Pakistan. Okay, that wasn't mentioned in Trump's truth, which was stopped with the personal participation of President Trump. In addition, the president exchanged views on the prospects for restoring Russian-American cooperation in various areas, which, in the opinion of the two presidents, have enormous potential. And then at the end of the conversation, both leaders described the exchange of views as positive and very productive. Both President Trump and our president confirmed their readiness to remain in constant contact with each other. I will also note that Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin highly appreciated the efforts of the US President's representative, Stephen Witkoff. This is approximately what I could say based on the results of the conversation that took place. So the what can we conclude from this? Trump seemed to be saying that, well, there's not going to be peace in Ukraine anytime soon. He said, I don't think this conversation really brought peace any closer. And Trump also said Russia is going to respond in a very strong way. And Trump is more or less saying, hey, we're going to have to take this. We're going to have to take this hit from Russia. Trump, isn't going to complain about this. The Russian side haven't accused Trump or the United States of being behind the attack on the strategic bombers. So, Ushakov had just simply said, Trump said there was no American involvement. He didn't say he believed it. He didn't say he didn't believe it. He just reported it. That's what Trump told us, which is also the official American position. We weren't involved, and we didn't know about it in advance. Um, so, and then they talk about this Iran thing. Um, Trump seems to want some Russian help on Iran, but it's not clear what Russia um, can do because if Trump sticks to his position that Iran cannot enrich uranium, then there's no deal. There's nothing Russia can do to help. So it's not clear at all what exactly Russia's role would be here. The negotiations are stalled because Trump having first said that in principle he doesn't have a problem with Iran enriching uranium has now taken the very absolutist position that Iran cannot enrich uranium inside Iran. That's a non-starter, and there's no way that Russia is going to embrace that position of the United States. I mean, he just said that that's not on. I mean, Russia is on the same page as the United States on Iran not having nuclear weapons, and Iran itself has said we don't want nuclear weapons, so that's not a problem. But Russia is not going to accept the American position that Iran not be allowed to enrich uranium inside Iran. So it's hard to see what exactly Russia can do here. Um, but I think what is the most salient point that came out from from Trump's truth is that he's now really uh, uh, giving up on Ukraine, really uh, coming to any kind of a peaceful settlement. I mean that is his most pessimistic um, declaration yet. Um, Now that's why it's so interesting, really, to learn. We haven't learned it yet. Maybe we will, as to who initiated this call. Did Trump initiate this call because he wanted to reassure Russia that the United States really wasn't involved in this attack? The United States didn't know anything about it in advance, and that's really now what Trump's main concern was, to prevent a serious escalation in a confrontation with Russia. And so you can see this conversation was fairly amicable. Trump's truth was quite friendly, and then the Kremlin readout, so to speak, or Ushakov's commentary was quite friendly. So the tension that had been building up since Sunday seems to have abated. But certainly Russia hasn't given any indication that it's preparing some huge attack on Ukraine. Only Trump has said that. And Trump said that that's the impression that he got from Putin. Russia's made no declaration that it's going to respond in this particularly dire way as Trump characterized it. So as things stand, I think the any serious confrontation between the United States and Russia, that I think has been the threat from that has abated, which is a good thing. We would assume United States, that Russia will attack Ukraine, but what exactly that would entail, whether it's going to be the usual launching of Kinjal missiles and drones and so on, or whether it'll be a more serious and threatening attack. We don't know with Oreshniks or and so on. We don't really know as yet. Um, and I think after that we'll have a clear idea of where we are. What I think is interesting that we first had that meeting and with Putin talking about the terrorist regime in Kiev. What's the point of talking to them? And giving the impression that there's really no point, that the talks are quite pointless. Um, and as I said, Trump's truth also suggested that really we're not any closer to peace than we were months and months ago. And yet, if you read the Ushakov statement, he's quite positive. Oh, we had, it's a useful meeting in Istanbul. Both sides are studying their respective memoranda. We'll hope that there's going to be another round of talks. So, in the end, at the end of the day, it seems like, well, maybe we're back on track, that there are going to be serious talks. So we don't know at this stage. Um, but at least Trump's silence, which I think was very troubling, has ended. It was troubling in the sense that his silence sounded as if it was a tacit acceptance and tacit approval of what Ukraine did. And that was, of course, very dangerous because then, Russians may well conclude that the United States was involved, knew about it in advance, and Trump himself thought this was quite a neat idea to attack Russian strategic aircraft. So that was a developing situation that was potentially quite dangerous. I think that danger has now subsided, and we'll have to see what the next steps are. Anyway, thank you very much for listening, and remember, if you like the gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye bye.